The day after Morrigan first spoke to her sisters, their war effort went into full swing, using the swiftness provided by the webway and the Bonezingers to rapidly mobilize, deploy, redeploy, relocate, and construct. Within the first day, one of the overlords had their tower raided, forces put down, bodies skewered, and corpse, silo, set aflame. Afterwards, the tower was fired upon by the naval cannons of one of the 3 Eldar ships in orbit and completely demolished. Then, following the planned war procedures, they repositioned to go to the next lowest tower on the planet and attacked it just the same. Using the webway gate, they were able to transfer over and attack before any significant force could be mustered to defend against them. The second overlord was quickly pulled from his tower and decapitated by Morrigan, as Guilliman, the Exodites, and the Wraiths held off the legions of pale, flabby corpses. Just as he was suspecting, the second sorcerer was more powerful, being quicker about its spells and having more corpses to throw at them. Still, it wasn't impossible to defeat, and their tower was destroyed all the same. The corpse was put on a wraithbone stake and sent off. Then they redeployed through the webway to the next highest tower and started the third assault. It was the third tower in which trouble started to actually arise in the battles. They had learned that they were being attacked at this point, and the defenses of the third sorcerer's domain was significantly more than the last 2. The toxin of the air around it was potent enough to burn away their cloaks and eat into their armor. The corpses were empowered by some spell to make their movements quicker, and the sorcerer had more war gear on its person. Still, between Guilliman himself, Morrigan, the Eldar snipers, and the Wraiths, the third sorcerer fell without casualties on their behalf, and their corpse was staked with the others. The tower burned, then demolished, but their armor was significantly ablated, and the corpses were only growing stronger. Their armor needed repairs, as did the Wraiths, an environmental sealing. That, and the sorcerers were sure to counterattack by assaulting the villages soon enough to stockpile more corpses to build larger armies. That's where the second phase of the war planning came into effect. While waiting for their armor to be repaired, and thus ready to resist the material-dissolving toxins of the higher towers, the corpses of the sorcerers were carried around to each of the villages, used as rallying standards, making sure that it was handled exclusively by a wraith and nothing living, of course. With the proof of 3 dead overlords, it made the besieged humans far more willing to listen to their proposals and follow the commands of the giants that were fighting on their behalf with food in hand and medicine to offer. Everything of value in their villages were packed up and moved through the webway gates, all of it cleaned by a legion of Eldar maids and priests, and then moved to the planned site of construction. Torchwood had been undergoing significant renovation and expansion since the first sorcerer fell, and the corpse had been displayed, with a chance to finally shed the despair of living under necromancers at hand and no small amount of fear from the openly sorcerous giants descending to command them. The village relented to have their home rebuilt from the ground up. A barren, rocky outcropping near the village became the foundations of a fortress made of summoned bone. Rising from the very earth and out of the air by song alone, a towering keep of cream-white contrasted against the pale muck of the world around it, even as awestruck villagers were given shovels, axes, and hoes of the same bone material, stronger than anything of metal that they had ever used before, free of rot and splintering handles. With tools in hand, these people were immediately asked to start digging the canals that would distribute the swampier regions across a larger section of land, thus increasing the total amount of farmland that would be available in the future and decreasing the amount of spawning pools that biting insects had available to breed within. They were escorted and protected by squads of Eldar warriors, making quick work of any pale that decided to attack. These canals would also serve as improvised pits and defensive lines in case of attack, which only added to the overall defensive nature of the region they had chosen to develop. Right alongside these human laborers, many Eldar worked. The Exodites were, after all, not warriors by trade. They were farmers and ranchers, All of this work was something they were well used to and had long since learned to enjoy. Land was cleared of tree and shrub, rocks hauled off to delineate paths and shore up potential regions of muck. Canals were dug to funnel water. Earth was tilled to make farmland. All of this work proceeded quickly with their new tools in hand, many hands with them, and eldar cooking to return to. The fortress was erected in a matter of hours, followed quickly by roads and bridges of the same pure white and quickly rising house structures, missing only the doors and furnishings inside to make them livable, but otherwise massive in scope, 2 stories each, with space for a warmly crackling hearth in the center of a well-insulated and well-ventilated main chamber. About 4 of these buildings were built every hour for many hours. Enough to house the entirety of Torchwood's roughly 1,000 original inhabitants were finished by the time the day was over. Guilliman had long since decided that he appreciated bonesinging quite a bit. The ability to summon structures such as this was incredibly helpful. By the end of the first day, 3 sorcerers had been slain, a fortress had been erected, the innermost buildings had been constructed. Old Torchwood had become obsolete aside from its farmland. Thousands of unbreaking and ever-sharp tools had been distributed. The canals had started to be dug. A dozen or so smaller villages had been evacuated, and their supplies in the process of being cleansed and blessed. And thousands of pale corpses had been burned. The sheer amount of work that could be done with a handful of bone singers and a few webway portals. He would have signed over a world for just one of each in the past. Wraithbone was able to repair itself over time. Another reason it was such a wondrous material. So all they had to do was wait for their armor to be repaired before attacking the next sorcerer. In the meantime, Guilliman set up the process of organizing a militia and Medicaid out of the healthier volunteers, armed and trained hospitaliers, who would be responsible for fighting the pale and fighting sickness among them. They were given short chopping swords, shields, light armor, and a few trainers. Merely giving men tools was not enough. You had to educate them on how to use them as well. Then, a few days later, their armor had been repaired, and another assault had been launched on the next tower. The 4th Overlord had spent his time preparing for their assault and had readied a titan made of fused corpses, stumbling forwards to crush the attackers beneath its massive bulk. It had not been prepared for the Wrath Knight Malrin to step out of a newly opened webway gate and rip into it with its sharp and ready ghostglaive, the proper name for its style of sword, as Guilliman had eventually learned. With most of his stockpile of corpses and preparations poured into that necrotic colossus, the sorcerer had little in the way of defenses and was quickly slain and mounted on another stake. Morrigan, taking yet another head of the thin, wiry, barely humanoid creatures that terrorized Barbarous for so long. She had started to smile already, looking at the corpses of the 4 sorcerers strung up like scarecrows on a distant hill. Her old scythe had already deteriorated into uselessness, and he was able to give her a war scythe of Wraithbone as a replacement. The victory had invigorated all of the people of Barbarous, and progress continued like that for some time. Men were trained, buildings were summoned, ditches were dug, and the winter on Barbarous passed at a steady pace. Work was constant, mood was high, and sorcerers were being killed every few days of preparation for each. Eventually, there was only 1 tower left, and the 13 inner cities of Barbarous had already been constructed, with white houses and white walls surrounding them all. A mere month had passed, and the Hospitaliers were starting to approach competency, and some 13,000 people worked and dwelt in the swiftly growing collection of settlements, relocated from the most distant corners of Barbarous first, and working their way inwards towards Torchwood. Each sorcerer was progressively more difficult to defeat. More preparations, more corpses to throw at them, more spells of poison and decay readied. Even being able to ignore the time it took to travel up the mountainsides to their towers only helped so much, with their armor starting to slough off fast enough to be visible at the 3rd to last sorcerer. Being able to attack through the webway gates helped negate much of the dangers of that as well. Only scant moments of exposure to the toxins before the gate was closed again, and then the process repeated until the sorcerers had nothing left to slow their attacks with. They had begun to suffer losses. 1. Wraith, taking a lobbed vial of explosive acid meant for a squad of living eldar. His soul stone disintegrating in psychic screams as the sorcerer was torn apart by angry exodites. There had been a funeral held on the ship afterwards, which he made sure to attend. Normally, Guilliman would be relatively pleased with so few casualties. Years of campaigning in these battles against Nurglite sorcerers. Only one loss was incredible compared to the grim expectations he would normally have. Spells of rot and infection would inflict massive long-term losses on human armies, regardless of how quickly or effectively the battles were carried out. But as the first loss of a remarkable campaign, Guilliman could only see it as an incredible failure on his part. He supposed he had gotten too used to things going right already, a very bad state to be in when the fate of the galaxy was at stake. He needed to carry the expectation that everything would go wrong, and with that thought in mind, he decided to review all the strategic information he had again. It was very fortunate that he did so, else he might have condemned a planet to death with his arrogance. It was never a struggle, he declared in perturbed realization, staring at a large map and various stacks of information gathered for this brief campaign. His hand brushed aside a sheet of paper to reveal the numbers listed upon them, then at the marked locations for each of the sorceress towers, then again at the marked locations for all the villages and their populations. It was all too consistent. There was never a war against the overlords. This planet isn't a battleground. It's a farm. He breathed out, hot air from his lungs creating misty vapors with the cold air of winter's end barbarous. Explain. Morgan growled out, leaning forwards to look down at the map and papers with him. He pointed at the locations for the towers, then at the villages, then at the list of estimated numbers of pale dead thus far. Each tower appears roughly random on its own, outside of its height, but when compared to the locations of each village and the populations in each, all of them are within the range of nearly the same number of overall people. If you compare the numbers of pale dead that they showed, they could rally at once. The overlords could have already swept over all remaining settlements with the weight of bodies. He leaned forwards, tapping the back of his hand on the table, but they chose not to. That means they want a human population on the planet and a human population almost perfectly equal between each tower. They were farming the people here, regularly sending pale dead to attack and cull the numbers when their harvests were ready. Morgan retreated into a slowly building fury, knuckles white around her scythe, as Asarnil leaned forwards to consider it on his own. Nodding once, Asarnil spoke a question with his brows furrowed. How fast do human populations increase? Guilliman considered it for a moment. Worlds such as these, the population would increase by about 10 to 20% per century. It depends on a multitude of factors. Guilliman at once understood what Asarnil was implying and quickly compared the lists. Morgan realized shortly after, not quite as experienced as either of the two of them, her eyes slightly widened as the implication settled upon her. 2. Not accounting for any corpses from earlier than that, or the supposed 10,000 in the last sorcerer's silos. He growled out, mind beginning to churn and revisit old information. There was something here, something that he was missing. There were rituals Necker would perform. Morgan began, voice low and hateful, where he would burn corpses to ash and cause something to grow immediately. That could be where the missing bodies are, sacrificed to fuel some magic. Corpses sacrificed to make something grow. That certainly sounded like a magic of Nurgle's, but almost nothing was growing on. Barbarous. Strangleweed, Guilliman whispered. Hands moving rapidly, he chopped urgently at a nearby seer. A map of the planet, quickly. The nearest seer obliged, an item of wraithbone placed on the table before them, and an exertion of psychic will later. A holographic display of the planet Barbarous appeared before him. The areas of brightest green highlight them in red. They began to glow a bright red, contrasting against the pale greens and whites of the planet in winter. The areas of arrowroot were massively expanded compared to a mere month ago. Arrowroot was supposed to do poorly in the cold, yet this had only grown larger in scale, expanded enough to see a visible shape starting to emerge between the numerous spots. Seer Yashan, please highlight the mountains in the same red, then flip the image upside down. Crossed his arms in front of his chest, eyes burning in ever more confident theory. The seer did as he was bid, and all present could see the shape beginning to emerge, a shape drawn in rapidly growing parasitic vines at a scale large enough to be seen plainly from orbit. I saw that symbol before in the Care's tomes. Morrigan's breath came out slightly unsteady as she stared at the massive spell circle being grown onto the planet itself. But I don't know what it means. 3 circles, arrayed in a rough triangle, split by 3 lines between each that met in the center, directly under the tower of the last sorcerer of Barbarous. It's the symbol of a daemon, the one that the sorcerers worship. Guilliman's frustration bled into an otherwise icy cold voice. It's a massive ritual that we completely overlooked. A Nurgle ritual with a spell symbol the size of a large continent, fueled by however many corpses the sorcerers had been burning to complete it. Something that they practically let happen under their noses. Guilliman, you brainless sloth. Our preparations here are completely useless. Asarnil declared, staring at it grimly. It's already almost complete. Killing the sorcerer isn't going to stop it at this point. The works of the Plague Father grow on their own. We don't have any large-scale weapons that can burn that much growth either. Guilliman's fingers felt numb in the cold, even as his heart burned with wrath. It's grown this much in a month. We likely only have days before it's complete. Guilliman exhaled mightily in frustration and stared at the cancer he had allowed to spread. We have to evacuate the planet immediately. Staying here when it's complete will likely doom us all. What? Morrigan burst out in fury. Mikael still lives. I need his head, she almost yelled out, steam bursting from her throat with the exclamation. Her eyes burned with a deeply set fury. Guilliman let his face distort with his frustration, and his hand came up to brush through his short hair. Our armor isn't repaired from the last battle, and won't be in time to launch a full attack while also saving these people. Guilliman began to reason out their situation. Choosing to attack him unprepared will almost certainly end with our deaths, and choosing to attack him after preparations are finished will mean staying on the world while the ritual is completed. So we shall stay and deal with it. It's just a big spell. Morrigan displayed her ignorance in another outburst of fury. He turned to her and let his eyes lock on her own. The eyes of a veteran who has seen too much clashed against the eagerness of youth. Slowly, painfully, Guilliman began. Morrigan, I have seen entire worlds die to the rot of this daemon. I have seen oceans turn to pus. I have seen cities rot to mounds. Maybe if I had been paying more attention earlier, maybe if I hadn't been so lax, this could have been avoided. But please, Morrigan swallowed, staring at his eyes. Please trust us in this. If we are here when a ritual this large is complete, it will kill us all. Morrigan glared, knuckles cracking furiously at him. Tiny drops of liquid pooled in the corners of the amber eyes. She broke the gaze first, teeth grinding as she glared at the ground. "I get to shoot the ship guns at his tower," she demanded harshly. Guilliman nodded, an understanding smile coming to his face. "Of course." He reached a hand out. Morrigan turned quickly, stomping away with heavy footfalls. Her boots shattered the frost on the ground with each impact. Guilliman let his hand fall back to his side as he watched her storm away. A final sigh escaped his lips as he turned back to Asarnil. Asarnil stared at him with a grim understanding. Guilliman reached up to rub his temple. The weariness of an unfinished task settled into his bones. "Call for the evacuation of the planet if you would. We'll have to work around the clock to escape in time." The evacuation of the planet's populace proceeded about as fast as it could. The situation was explained quickly to the inhabitants of Torchwood, who were able to quickly repack and start loading onto the Eldar ships through one of the 3 webway gates. Each of the remaining ships were of the same rough proportions and model as Charnak's Pride itself, being a 5-kilometer affair with laser-based weaponry and fightcraft bays. By his memory of comfortable living space to cargo bay scale for evacuations such as these, compared to the size of the bay, he estimated about 48,000 people could stay in each ship and remain distant enough to not increase the risk of illnesses too drastically. 13,000 currently live in Torchwood and its surrounding settlements. They were already brought up to cleanliness standards that were required of them, their items already processed, and their crop already turned into longer-lasting breads and jerkies. They were able to be packed in the ship within the day. It was the rest of the planet that would cause the most delays. Each village had to be visited separately, brought onto the ship, their crops and supplies loaded, their bodies and items cleaned, and psychically scanned for lingering hints of rot. People brought in the ships in batches of 20 to 100 starving and superstitious humans, being told they had to go with the strangers using magic, otherwise they would die in a few days. Guilliman didn't allow himself time to rest, not when so many lives had to be saved from this place. He worked constantly, stepping through webway gates to speak to scared villagers, to convince them of the danger, to help load their supplies, to get them through the portals and off the planet. This was in addition to the constant stream of pale dead that seemed to issue forth from every corner of the world, every dead suddenly rousing to attack everyone on the planet. Torchwood was being stripped of anything useful, and the Eldar and Hospitaliers present had to fight in shifts to keep the dead from surging forwards to attack the legions of workers and conscripts. The villages currently under attack often had to be evacuated without gathering up much of their supplies, if any, with hundreds of corpses surging forth in endless tides. Guilliman could fight off any number of them, but he couldn't be everywhere at once. Petra, Aurelia, and Cassandra took it upon themselves to help manage the processing of the humans evacuated. He wasn't sure how. He wasn't there to observe with how busy he was moving between villages. He was grateful for their assistance. He had thought Morrigan was helping to defend the evacuation of Torchwood's supplies and materials. For an entire day he thought this. It was in a brief moment of inaction that Asarnil, managing his half of the operation, had urgently told him that she had been seen running off towards the highest mountain peak, that the seers were too blinded by the psychic rot enveloping the planet to see where she was. Opening a webway gate on the peak of the mountain would let the ruinous air through, killing everyone without protection in the middle of evacuation. That was everyone they were trying to save. A frigid feeling settled in his core, a feeling that had nothing to do with the cold of barbarous winter. Guilliman stepped through a hasty webway gate, foot landing at the base of the mountain in the center of a rotting world. His helmet had been taken off to help convince the people of Barbarous. He had no time to retrieve it. His shield was adjusted, strapping against his upper arm. His armored boots shattered more fragile stones, as he raced across rocky plains leading up to the tops. The scant mosses gave way to bare rock, and soon his panicked stomps were shattering them as well. A canyon loomed in front of him. He bundled his legs and leapt titanically, soaring hundreds of feet through air that had more in common with hair-curling cleaners than anything breathable. His sword stabbed into the mountainside, an improvised pick that he used to throw himself up the increasingly steep slopes. His hand grabbed a rocky outcropping. It slipped. He snarled and punched forwards, his fists smashing through frozen rock and creating a handhold where none had existed before. A tiny bruise formed and quickly faded on his knuckles. His breath was held, only coming out in a thin and constant exhale, forming wispy lines of hot steam that traced behind him on his ascent. His exertion formed a thin sheet of sweat on his brow, providing a tiny layer of protection on his skin from the increasingly difficult-to-endure atmosphere. He climbed only in leaps now, shattering the rock beneath each massive bound up the mountain. An avalanche following in the wake of his ascent, burning swords stabbing into rock, fists crashing into stone, acid air futility attempting to hinder his advance upwards. He didn't bring adequate protection. He desperately hoped that his sister was wiser than him. Another gigantic bound upwards. The peak was in sight. His armor began to hiss, vapors of psychic bone trailing alongside his own exhalation, following him up the bald peaks. The distant rumbling of the rock slide behind him only continued to grow. Another gigantic leap upwards. It was getting harder to see. His clothes began to burn away, dissolving in strips. Pain began to emerge, alongside bloody knuckles and sore limbs. His sword burned white, and the worst of the flesh-melting air could not reach him through its hateful flames. Another gigantic leap brought him screaming over the rim of the mountain's peak. His skin began to peel off in strips. Pain enveloped him like a burning embrace. He ignored it all. The pace of the world seemed to slow as hyperactive adrenaline pumped through his superhuman body. He took in the scene as he rose. Morrigan was struggling to push herself up in the midst of a stone courtyard, glaring hatefully at the bloodless, almost human with arms spread wide and joyfully before her. Despair crept up in her eyes. Her armor was sizzling. She could barely stand. She was alive. She was in appropriate armor for this. It was barely holding together. Her gaze shifted to him as he rose over the edge of the mountain's peak. Amber eyes behind a clear visor slowly widened. The sorcerer slowly turned his head to see what was behind him. Too many eyes with too little symmetry to be human. Each widened behind heavy horn-riddled brows and ridges. A furious giant glared at him. His flesh hissed, mixing with the trail of his low exhale. He raised the sword above his head, grabbing it in both of his skinless hands. The sorcerer attempted to throw himself to the side. Morrigan threw herself in the other direction. Guilliman brought his sword down. A tsunami of golden flame enveloped the mountaintop, a brightly burning ocean that burst forwards, turning the sorcerer and the tower behind him to ash. The upper portion of the monolith slowly fell, pulled down in the wave of psychic inferno and disappearing just the same. He felt weary as his feet landed on the courtyard of the mountaintop. He couldn't waste time being tired. Every moment here sapped his strength and burned his flesh. His sister said something. The ringing in his ears didn't allow him to hear it. Her eyes were wide and horrified. He tried to say something. His lips weren't responding. He couldn't pronounce the words. He grunted in frustration. He'd tell her later. She had to know that she was too important to sacrifice on some unimportant sorcerer on some backwater planet like this. He grabbed her by the shirt and hauled her up, stomach on his shoulder, his hand on her legs. He almost swayed, increasing the fury he aimed at himself. His feet crashed against the stone of the courtyard and sent him flying off the edge of the peak, down the mountainside, in a clumsy drop. He had to get far enough away from the air of the peak to make a webway gate safe. An outcropping was about to collide with his legs. He kicked, shattering it, and sending him forwards down the mountainside again. Gravity pulled him faster and faster. He exhaled the last of his breath with the impact, coming out in a great plume of hot, expended air. The ice-cold winds numbed his flesh of the pain it should be in. He kicked off the mountainside again, cracking the rock face for a dozen feet at his impact site. Blood began to form around his flesh like a second skin, clotting quickly enough to serve as a shell of red where his scraps of armor no longer covered. He kicked off the mountainside again, descending far quicker than his initial rise, aided by the pull of the planet. His feet smashed into sharp stones, cutting into his flesh in small amounts, but breaking the world beneath his stomps. A grim light began to emerge from the distant horizon, cutting through the pale mists with shockingly toxic green. A wave of disgust washed over him as he beheld it. He felt Morrigan convulse and retch. Lines began to write themselves on the sky above, thousands of miles across, like an aurora of nauseating colors and shapes. A jolly chorus began to echo through the winds as the milky sky twisted into a more putrid, pale yellow. His legs kicked off the stone again, sending him flying forwards. But the stone did not shatter. It crumbled instead, falling in on itself like rotten wood. The sword of the Emperor burned like a supernova in his grip, wrestling foul winds with the smell of fire and ash. His shield shined lustrous gold against the backdrop of a drained world. The ritual had been completed within a day, in some hours it seemed. An unfortunate thing, but not impossible to handle. A rolling laughter emerged from the mountain behind him. The sides of the rock all around him began to fall in on themselves, and their shapes began to contort into writhing, nigh-organic forms. The stench grew increasingly unbearable. He kicked off the side again. The rock wobbled like blubber as he flew forwards over the ravine he had noticed previously, the bottom now filled with a yellow-white river, from which squat green and pink creatures began to crawl up from, their mischievous, watery eyes sitting inconsistently over happy smiles filled with rotten yellow teeth. He swung his sword before landing again, turning a massive section of bleeding loam into warped volcanic rock. Kicking off this shattered it behind him, and sent his forwards yet again. Morrigan began to convulse on his shoulder. His blue eyes glared at the parade of crawling, rotten creatures that stretched out their arms towards him as he soared over their malformed heads. Oh, we weren't expecting visitors, children. Quickly, don't be rude. An ancient fatherly tone boomed like a massive iron bell behind him. His voice dripped with corrosive rust. Thousands of eyes turned towards him, sword shining bright in an ocean of ambiguous and rotten shades. Share with our guests. Spells of toxin and bile crested like a battalion of catapult fire towards him. He swung, a wave of golden fire crashing into a waterfall of filth in the air before him. He continued to fall, feet crashing against the rotten skull of some mammothine Xeno, and sending him flying forwards again. Sour mists in the air swirled, and bloated flies emerged from the foaming winds. They raced forwards to latch onto him. Guilliman let loose another wave of furious heat, turning their bodies to ash. Spells of rot crashed against his golden shield and turned to dust upon touching its light. It wasn't enough on its own. Twin candles of gold in a churning sea of browns and greens gripped in blood-red arms. Oh! You're hurt, visitor. Visitor, please, let me help you. The voice boomed out in worry. A massive hand began to rise from the earth before him. Miles around the emerging hand turned into mire and murk. Trees and rocks sinking into a newborn sea of decaying life. The hand crashed against the murk, sending waves of filth around it. The arm strained, and a wretched, bloated face pulled. its way out of the brackish amniotic ocean. Teeth, the shade of daisies. Eyes frosted over and squatly set under massive slabs of heavy, spongy flesh. It was smiling at him, grin stretching all the way back to almost touch the vestigial ears underneath a crown of twisted wooden antlers. Maggots fell in rivers from the wide smile, and a tattered hood of red struggled in vain to cover the bloated head of the titan rising from the mire. Sickly vines rapidly grew from the water surrounding the colossus, twisting and writhing even as it died and withered away again. Lily pads and seaweed began to choke the ocean of filth, even as the leaves choked in a whirl without proper sunlight. He swung his sword down, parting the foul sea under a wave of ash making gold. The ground beneath him was solid only for a moment, which he used to kick off and soar through the air once more. Jolly and permissive chuckles mocked his actions, booms of laughter trailing after him just like his hot breath did. There's no need to be so panicked, dear child. You're in the care of the Great Father now. What could you have to worry about? The great unclean one called after him. The winds above his head twisted, and storm clouds of poison began to form, rolling in from every angle around him, slowly approaching from the horizon. Please. Let me help you. A rain of laser fire screamed down from the heavens. The clouds burned and scattered as the hot plasma evaporated seas of rot and pus. The world shattered inwards, runes of elegant script writing themselves in the air in the distance, pushing back the foulness of the world surrounding them. A melting earth turned into an island of solid rock and bone. Songs of power began to clash against jolly chuckles, overpowering them and allowing the music of the eldar to set the rhythm of the world. The ghosts of eldar stepped forth from the tear in the world over the island, their arms carrying long guns that fired ceaselessly at all things that attempted to approach the island. Behind them, a legion of living stepped forwards, carrying guns of their own and letting loose a constant stream of fire and psychic song. Oh, there's no need to be rude. The mountainous voice boomed in parental scolding. I have gifts for you, children. It opened its mouth, letting loose a river of bile as it attempted to chant a spell. A giant of bone stepped through the hole in reality, crashing into the great unclean one and forcing it back hundreds of feet, booming out a war poem as it did so. I marched into the sanctuaries of those, people and tread upon the jeweled idols of their putrid god. Wraith Knight Malwern roared as his sword cut a ruinous gash against the flabby arms of the great unclean one. Plates of bones steamed in the hot murk of the swamp it strode upon. Guilliman swung his blade, turning a score of tainted sea and writhing smiles into solid ash. He kicked off this, soaring through the air yet again, getting closer to the Isle of Singing Bone. Oh, if it isn't little Melrin. You know I was talking to your mother just the other century. She misses you, you know. Why don't you visit her? The mountain of filth was unbothered by the new tear in its flesh, attempting conversation even as its fist crashed against the shield of the giant of bone. I strode into the gates of life and death and of the end of all. Things in the death of Elden gods. Malwern boomed out, guns mounted on his massive shoulders, screaming out bursts of laser fire that turned tumors into burns, even as the form of the great unclean one shifted and formed a new series of hideous mouths all across its enormously fat body. Another wave of fire came from his increasingly fatigued hand. Morgan had stopped shaking some time ago, but he could feel her heartbeat. She was still alive. Rot was burned to ash. He leapt off this temporary place of burned pus and towards the island of bone. The very air was starting to melt their armor, and the island grew almost as fast as it now started to shrink. I beheld ruination and found it wanting before my blade. The Wraith Knight screamed in cold fury even as its legs began to melt in the mire below. Even as its psychic shield was gnawed upon by creatures of bile and laughing poison. Even as its colossal blade clashed against an ever-dying staff of gnarled wood. Guilliman soared to the portal, over the heads of singing eldar, body crashing against the bone floor of stable reality. The living and the dead pulled back through the portal, their guns firing all the while. They stepped back through, and the first gate in reality snapped shut. In the distance, a second gate opened up for a brief moment, and the head, torso, and arm of a giant of bone fell through. Parasites of rot on his form washed away with waves of psychic fires. The giant strained for a moment before letting itself go limp against the floor of the hangar with a titanic thud. The gate above its head snapped shut, a fingertip of rot cut off at the joint and falling into the psychic fires of the numerous eldar surrounding the ruinously damaged giant. Guilliman rolled over, staring at the ceiling for a moment, before forcing himself up to glance at his sister. She was breathing. She was alive. Eldar in robes of white rushed towards them. He let his face collide with the floor of bone, the pain of skinless flesh finally reaching him again. His rapidly clotting blood sealing in his injuries, but not healing him. His nerves screamed at him. He had made it. They were safe. The Sarnal could handle the rest for right now. Everything went black.